this will be exhibition game number 6, and today my special guest is Takanashi-san from Japan, and of course everyone knows him because he is a 5-time world Othello champion. So thank you very much for accepting my invitation, and let's have a great game ahead.
で、今日の招待を受けてありがとうございます。で、アレックさんが言ってみました。
こちらこそ貴重な機会をありがとうございます。よろしくお願いします。
Okay.
Thank you for the precious opportunity.
No. It's my opportunity to learn from him. So maybe before we begin, I'll just quickly go over the kind of format for exhibition game. So very quickly, it's how we will play is it's a 30-minute time control, and basically before we make each move in the game, we will you can think silently, or you can think or speak along the way, and basically before you make each move, you should try to articulate as much as possible your thoughts and your thought process and how you arrive at that move before actually clicking on the space and making the move. So I know that this you may not be used to this format, but hopefully you can try to adjust and also be aware of your time control as well.
はい、今日のゲームの仕方ちょっと説明させていただきます。30分のゲームで、自分で考えてもいいし、話してやってもいいし、でもなるべく動きして前にその自分の考えをなるべく説明しながら皆さんにその後ろの考え方を伝えてゲームをやりましょう。はい、というのは今回のゲームの趣旨です。
OK です。
で、日本語でよろしいです。
わかりました。
はい。
Okay. So yeah, thanks, Keith. So once we begin the game, Keith will actually drop off from the call, so it'll just be me and you, and I'll be speaking my thoughts in English. So basically, the English speakers get to know, what my thought process is for the moves. And for you, you can just go ahead and speak in Japanese. And of course, I think this game will also allow Japanese viewers and audience to enjoy very much on understanding your thought process in the game.
なのでアレックさんは英語で英語が話せるのを皆様にゲームの考え方を伝えます。で、高梨さんは日本語で説明して、日本語を見てくれる皆様に日本語でその考え方を伝えます。
OK?
Okay. So if that's the case, I think we can start the game.
で、今スタートします。で、僕はこれでちょっと失礼して、
はい。
で、ゲームの後また戻ってくる。
わかりました。ありがとうございます。
じゃあ2人とも頑張ってね。
Okay, thank you, Keith. Bye.
Okay, bye bye.
Okay, Takanashi-san.
Hi.
Are you okay? Do you want to choose color or?
どっちでも
Oh, both are okay.
Alex choice.
Okay. I will choose black then.
OK?
Okay. So 始めましょうか。
はい。
Okay. お願いします。
お願いします。グッドラック。
Okay. Okay, so the game has started and I'm basically playing as black. I always start with E6, so I'll just go ahead with my first move.
アレックスから招待を受けて対局をします。普通に勝手通りします。
Okay. So I know Takanashi plays perpendicular, so it's not surprising to see him play his usual perpendicular sequence. So over here, I would like to try to challenge him with a certain opening, which is probably something that most people know that I play, which is towards the rose branch of openings.
アレックスが何言ってるか全然わかりませんが、しばらくはアレックスの出方を伺いながら、ついていこうかなと思います。鎖か馬かですかね。
Okay, so basically Takanashi has played the standard book sequence. So um, if I were to play d3, that would be a standard leading to horse. Sorry, c3, and then of course if I were to play c5, it's the standard book to rose opening. And I think c6 is something that is more unconventional. So I'll go ahead and play the usual sequence to c5, essentially just taking one disc against the back of two disc row, and just trying to maintain the edge towards the access into the center. So yep, I'll play the c5 move.
ウサギかな。この辺も特に自分は白から変化をするようなタイプではないので、普通に定石通りに打っていきます。
Okay. So Takanashi has played essentially the usual book sequence, which is somewhat expected. So yeah, one of the reasons why I chose black is to kind of challenge him in this opening, which is the shaman opening. So this is kind of a pre-planned opening, and I'll be playing c6 as a variation to shaman.
なるほど。そんなによく見る変化ではないですけど、たまにね、ネットのオセラとかがこういうのを使うのを見たことはあります。今は、考えているというよりはちょっと思い出す作業をしていて、E の7だったかなか F の7だったかなみたいなことを考えています。あれ C3 もあったかな。ちょっと久しくオセロしてないもんでだいぶ記憶が薄れてますけど、いやでも記憶をたどって E の7だった気がするんでそこにします。
Okay, so Takanashi has played e7, which is a standard book sequence against the shaman opening, which the interesting fact about the shaman opening is basically setup of a sequence towards the edge onto the left, and then now just kind of diving down to the bottom, picking up one disc and using a very phased approach from bottom up in order to approach the center. So another option that I have is to play to f5 to jump into the center, expecting like a f6 response to kind of clamp the disc down, and white just keeping to his side. So over here I'll just play the standard book sequence, which is essentially f8. Over here just taking one disc and just making my way up.
なんかおぼろげに今思い出したような気がしていて、第一感は C の3、第一感というか過去の記録を頼りに確かここが最善だったんじゃないかなっていうようなことを今思い出して、確認して多分大丈夫かなという気がするので、そのまま打ち込もうかな。そうします。C3に打ちます。
Okay, so white has played c3, which is again I think still within the book line, and over here it's kind of like a head and tail theory, c3 being the head of the end of this diagonal 3 disc row, if you will, e5 being the tail end of it. So typically I would then instinctively look at f6 as a kind of like a natural response to white just heading towards the top from the center to the top left direction. So yeah, essentially e6 would almost jump out as a natural response to that. So I'll be going ahead with that move.
ちょっとこの辺からそんなに実践経験もないような展開になってきていて、思い出すっていうよりはちょっと読みも入れつつっていう思考にシフトしようかなと思っています。第一感は、F の6、今黒に C の4を狙われているので、一回そこを打てなくする、 まあ、F6 で F7 ですね。F の7、F の5と打たれて、まあ、その次 C7 とかになるのかなぐらいのことを今考えてます。そうね。まあそうですね。まあ、読みとしては F7、F5、C7、D7 で D の3で、まあ C8 打ってくれば C の4が打てるかなぐらいの読みかな。まあ読み抜けしてないことを思いつつそうしますかね。まあダイヤもねそんなにないかな。まあ、あるとしたら B の5とか B の6とか。ただちょっと地味品な気がするんで第1回の通り F7 にします。
Okay, so white has played to f7, which is a nice cut into the center, quiet move, which is the key disc over here at e6. So next would then be about contesting the kind of mid-game centralization. So over here, basically white has removed the access to c4, and d3 basically is too loud, which gives an easy c4. So naturally the kind of sequence that I like to follow is to jump into the center at f5.
なんかさっきの読みだったらここで死なのつもりだったんですけど、なんか別に必要ないかなって今この形を見てちょっと思ったので、というのも、まあ、D3、D7 で C4 が打てるんで、そっちでいいかな。なんか C7、D7 の交換がそんなに意味を持たない気がしてきたんで、まあ、ちょっと気になるところとすれば D3 の後 G8 とかがあるのかなってのをちょろっと警戒しなきゃいけないかなぐらいですかね。まあ、一応今はそう仮にそう打たれたら大丈夫かなってことを考えてます。C7、C3、G8 だったら、まあすぐ大変当てるのか、C7 からいくのか。まあなんか大丈夫そうな気がしてきました。下辺当てからで、2、3、G8 だったら下辺当てて、取らせて、20側出てみたいな形で、まあ十分かなということで、まあ多分来ないんじゃないかな。なので T3 にします。
Okay, so Mr. Takanashi has played to d3, essentially regrouping and at the same time keeping his control along the fourth row. He still has access nicely to c4 for the regroup. In exchange, I also have access to d7 as a regroup. But if I were to play a d7 cross and allow white to jump over for immediate crisscross to c4, that would not be too ideal. Because it's basically somewhat like a mid-game parity in a sense that when I play one move and white plays another move and we achieve an equilibrium shape, it becomes very difficult for me to actually continue playing on. So over here, one of the other choices that I'll look to is potentially trying to cut into the fourth row and hit on to the fourth row. However, no matter how I cut, I'll always be slower than white because white has established two discs on E6 and F7 discs, which provide access unless I were to play say G7, which is a C square, and it's somewhat risky over here. So over here, I would then elect to jump into the center to try to gain that access. At the same time, anticipate for that c4 response, so that I can play both e2 and d2 consecutively. So yeah, let me try e2.
これちょっと予想外というか、確かにこっちの方が打たれてみると嫌だなって感じですかね。単純に D7C4 だったら、白がやや優勢かなと思っていたので、これでもまだ序盤黒が変化した分、形勢判断としては白の方がややいいんじゃないかなと思っています。プラ2から4ぐらいですかね。今その争点になっていた C の4狙われていたので、その C4 に自分から打ち込むか、それが第一感で、それ以外の手も一応検討しつつ、C4、D2 の後にどうするかっていうところまで結論つけてから打ちたいかな。そんなに良さそうじゃないように見えてきたなっていうのが今印象ですね。 C4D に対して、となると大案としては相手に C4 は許すけど D のに C4 を打たせたから、B4 とかで今度は C の2を狙っていくような形も考えつつ、ただ黒の D7 が残ってるんでちょっと嫌だなと思ってます。なのでちょっと今喋りながら考えてた結果、C7 周りかなって今思い始めてきました、この局面で。C7、D7、その子が入れた後にさっきの D2 だったり、下辺をさばいていく手はちょっとどうかな。C7、D7、E8、D8、C8、B8 で下辺取らせて C の4ってのもあるけど、ちょっと辺が山になってしまうなど余裕手になってしまうのでちょっと怖いかな。なので今の大感というか今の第一候補としては C7、D7、D2 にしようかなと思ってます。そうします。
Okay, so White has played to c7, which is somewhat unexpected because it opens up an easy response for me to d7, which, yeah, it could potentially be deceptively good for me, but at the same time, it's a bit worrying in terms of how he can then potentially respond to cut into the center, either by jumping in to the bottom. There's still quite a few tempos for him. At the same time, there's also an option that if I were to play the d7, he can jump out to the left and also to the right. So definitely d7 is probably the first instinct response. Following the head and tail theory, there's another option to consider, which is to g3, but g3 followed by White's b5 potentially kind of gives away the access to d7, and it doesn't allow me to form a compact shape. Another option was the kind of move that I was looking at to play to d2 or c4. Both of them are kind of like a pair, whereby regardless of where White plays on either ends, I'm expected to play. So now that White has kind of jumped into c7, I feel that I would kind of lose out in mid-game parity if I were to play either of this move. Because I'm waiting for White to say play d2, and then I can jump into c4 or vice versa, basically. So one of the key ideas about the shaman opening for black is to maintain the center shape and wait for opportunities, and at the same time, at this point, the shape is quite important for black to maintain the bottom edge. So with that in mind, I'm gonna go with d7 and just wait for a response from him and see how that plays out. So one of the threat about d7 is probably potentially a follow-up combo move to e8, d8, followed by him feeding me the unbalanced edge, and I'll be forced to take it, and it opens up a quiet move for him to c4 essentially. So black, white, black, white, black, white. So yeah, I think I'll go ahead with the sequence and see whether that plays out.
ちょっとどうかな、なんか互角ぐらいになってしまったような気がします。さっきの読みであればここで D2 だったんですけど、ちょっと他の手もいろいろ見えてきたんでまた考え直します。D2 は単純に、黒の G3 とかもちょっと嫌かなっていうところで、あともう一個さっき言っていた下辺当てていく手、E8、D8、C8、B8 の C4 っていう手はその次なんかね、いわゆる下辺一色の山、ペア山だったりを狙われたりしそうな気がして、ちょっとね、見た目の、手順の流れの感触としてはすごくいいんだけど、ちょっと怖いかなっていうところで、あんまり選びたい手順ではないですね。もう一個、相手の考慮中に思いついた手としては、ここで D の8、これが今どれだけ有効かってことを考えていて、でもあんまり良くないですね。いや D8、A8、G8 って取っていくことを考えたんですけど、その後すぐ黒が C8 で当てる必要ないですね。当てる必要あるんだったら、白がそれでもやれるかなっていう印象でしたけど、このミニラインですかね、D の7から F の5までのミニラインが取ってるんで、直ちに黒が下辺手を入れる必要はないので、ちょっとそれも微妙なので、なので、D8 は候補から除外します。あとはもう一個直接もう真の4叩き込んじゃって、これもなくはないかなと思ってますね。いわゆるラストボックスなんていうね、4×4 の真ん中のところの最終手はかなり、高確率でリードになることが多いんで、それも考えてもいいんですけど、ちょっとどうかな、やりすぎかなっていう気がするけど、なくはなさそうですね。なので今候補としては D の2、C の4、もしくは下辺当て E の8かな。いやー、なんか C の4が一番いいように見えてきていますね。C の4から、D の8の処置の下辺当てっていうことを狙っていけそうだなって今思っているので、そうしようかな。ちょっとね、時間もそこそこ使っているんで、かなりこうさっきまでの3手読み、5手読みなんかとはかなり違う手順になってきますが、ちょっと直接打ち込んじゃいます。
Okay, so white has played c4. To be honest, this is kind of unexpected. Quite a surprising move in terms of how he got there. I'm pretty sure that he had quite a long string of logic and explanation. And yeah, I'll be probably curious to kind of find out more after the game. So over here, white has essentially closed off all the left side. So probably the first instinct that I would think about is to try to kind of make use of the two white discs to the right of the board. Try to bring him in. At the same time, I need to be aware that white has a move to d8 and multiple tempo, potentially d8, e8, even though I do have a quiet move in response to that to c8. So I would kind of categorize the bottom edge as a one tempo for white. So having that in mind, I'll start to look to the right edge for some moves. Ideally, I would want a disc on g5. On g6 to actually try to regroup down to e8. But at the same time, I don't have that access or that luxury at the moment. So probably my top choices, instead of flipping two discs on the surface almost immediately with g3 or even g4, g5 would be probably a preferred option to kind of just spend one external disc at a time. So I would kind of put g5 as one of shortlisted options. At the same time, I'll also look to the top edge to kind of prevent white's advancement to d8. So I'll also look at d2, which momentarily controls this mini diagonal between d3 to f5 disc, which kind of prompts him to respond elsewhere. So potentially a regroup move towards d2 would also be an option. So d2 or g5 could be possible options. I almost wouldn't really consider any of the moves on the left edge, even though it's generally advisable to look at all your options. Also because if I were to play any of the moves to the left, it's just unnecessarily breaking this edge that he has kind of closed off. Probably the only move that I would consider on the left side, or potentially to c2 or b3, essentially these are the two moves. But over here, white has a follow-up move to potentially grab this mini diagonal to e3 to f4 by playing f2. So this is one concern that I have almost immediately. So that's probably not what I want to see. So if I were to compare, say, b3 and c2 versus d2, d2 helps me retain one more disc along this mini diagonal. So even if white just plays to f2 in response, I'll still be able to retain a nice diagonal cutout to g5 in response. If I were to play g5 right now, white has potentially also some options to kind of nestle in between. So, and also to play to the bottom. So it's just kind of weighing between those two options right now. So I can safely say that I would like to play either g5 or d2 at this point in time. So now it's just more about figuring out what discerns between those two moves. So if I were to kind of look further ahead, if I were to play g5 and expect a white's response to either to the top edge or grab the bottom edge as a regroup, let's say g5, if white were to play to d8, I would then follow up with one more move to regroup to the side at g4 perhaps. Then I could then anticipate white could potentially play to the top edge in search for some tempo. So I would say that g5 is more of a move that, it's a direct, straightforward exchange in tempo where both players just play to their sides, whereas d2 is somewhat of a more interactive move, at the same time just hoping that white interacts more or potentially makes a mistake potentially. So I would actually prefer to play a more interactive move at this point in time rather than a straightforward tempo exchange move. So let me just go with d2 then.
まあ多分序盤の黒変化からまだ白が一応優勢保ててるのかなっていう形勢判断でいて、D の2、そんなに考えてなくて、確かに打たれて一番嫌かもしれないですね。他の手だったら結構優勢が保てるかなと思っていたんですけど、ちょっともう一回考え直しですかね。D の8はね、打てるようにしておきたいなっていうのが1個。今候補としては、F の 青に、もしくは右側 G の34、G の456、ここの4つかな、主に。あと、強いてあげるなら D の1とかもあるかなぐらい。ただこれはあんまり考えてないです。で右側手入れる時の、注意点というか、例えばなんか G3、G6 とかだと、その後々、G3、G4、G5 にしようか。そうすると、もう一回言いますね。G4 か。G4、G6、G5 だと、E の8と黒に下辺を取り込まれてしまうので、これだとさすがに黒が、下辺を落ち着けてしまって、黒が良くなってしまう気がするので、あんまりちょっと候補から外れるかなというか、同じ理由で G の5も G5、G6、G4 だと下辺 E の8と固められてしまうので、打つとすれば、G5、G6 に対しては H の6と引っ張るとか、もしくは G4、G6 でも H の6かと引っ張って下辺の黒い端は防がないといけないかなっていう思考でいます。そういった点では最初から G の6に自分が打ち込んでしまっては良さそうには見えますが、ただこの場合は G の6、H の6と引っ張られるとやはりあんまり得をしているような形ではないかな。E の8をやっぱり狙われてしまうので、なので D になるのかなといった読みでいますが、D に G5 もそこまで白が良いようにも見えないんですけど、今は、D に打つか、右側は打つとすれば G5、G6、H6 があるかな。その今2通りで絞って読みます。やっぱり右側白から辺に出るのはちょっと黒の右下方面のさばきがしやすくなる気がするんで、消去法でに、F の2か F の2にします。
Okay, white has played to f2, which is somewhat of an expected move. At the same time, he's cutting into the center, getting the d4 disc in excess, giving himself options to d8. So over here, the natural kind of thing to probably, if I were to play blitz, my first instinct could potentially just maintain it to the center shape. G5 or G4 could be possible options. B6 could be more of a hit and tail theory, more of an interactive move instead of a kind of passive move. But at the same time, after white has jumped out to f2, there is a potential continuation over here for white to play to c1 and just capture the edge with a strong edge in a manner of c1, and that basically follows with a natural d1 e1 response, and then essentially I don't have an access to c2, so that is kind of like a strong edge in terms of tempo for white. So that's also something that I want to think about. And also this C column of discs, it's still important for my bottom edge to play out, in a sense that it still maintains one tempo for my opponent, in a sense that if white were to play the d8 followed by e8, I can still keep c8 as something of a quiet move in that sense. So over here, I'm just weighing between the options, considering I have two discs in the form of f3 and f4. I like to actually keep that center shape to the right. So if I were to play the g4, that would essentially be taking away both discs at once. So just in terms of disc flipping, I would weigh g5 as something slightly more favorable than g4 because I get to keep more discs at the time being. So let me just play that out in my mind. G5, if he goes down to D8, I'll grab G4 or potentially even G3, which kind of creates a space for both ends, in a sense that if I were to play G5 and he plays D8, I play G3. If you were to play to say G4, I still have G6. If you were to play to G6, I don't have G4, but in a sense that I can still keep to the right bottom right edge by just dragging out one move to H6 and potentially looking for more options to the right edge. So that's probably the consideration that I have right now. Just looking at the other move, which I previously mentioned, was at B6. B6 is a bit concerning because I'm just breaking the edge unnecessarily while I'll have the active disc to the right to play to. So probably wouldn't make sense. So I think right now, just looking purely at G5 or G4, I would take G5 because G5 at the same time it prevents C1 from happening, and it also helps to retain more discs. So I guess I'll go with G5.
まあ一番打たれて嫌な手ですけど、まあ一回 G3 手を入れないといけないのかなっていうとこですかね。まあG3 か、まあ、G6 かですけど、まあ G3 の方が勝るかな。ちょっと理由説明するのはなかなか難しいですけど、まあ、G6、G3 とかが、なんか黒の方が打ちやすくなってしまう気がするんで、まあ、考えとしては G3、G4 に対して H の4だったりっていうことを今考えてます。まあ、それで右辺取っていって十分じゃないかなっていう読みですかね。G3、G4、H4、H5、H6、H3、H2、G6、H7 なんて形で右辺山にできれば、まあ、その後ね、まあ、黒の地出しとかもなんかありそうではあるんですけど、まあ、C の1ランクからおそらく1点粘れるような展開になるんで、まあ、1点粘れれば、まあ、黒を左側に引っ張り出せれば優勢になれると思うんで、なんとか引っ張り出したいなっていう今思いでいます。まあ、1個気になるのは G3 に対して H の3という手が黒からあるのかどうか、まあ、その対処法をちょろっと考えつつ、でもまあ結論としては G3 で変わりなさそうなので、あまり時間を使うのもあれなので打ってから考えます。
Okay, so White has played the G3. Somewhat unexpected in a sense that it gives me an immediate response to G4, makes me wonder what exactly is his intent. Potentially it's just to shave off that tempo from me, since I was going to probably play G4 anyway, and he feels less threat of establishing that G3 disc in terms of how I can interact with it. If I were to jump into G4, I'm anticipating potentially he plays excuse me, H4, or potentially D8. So I'm thinking there's a higher chance for him to play the D8 than H4, but essentially both moves somewhat kind of poisons one another. So that's kind of the strength of the Shaman opening in terms of maintaining that centralized shape. So I think it's fairly easy for me to jump in. At the same time, I also want to check that none of my black discs are along this kind of mini diagonal between the E1 to H4 disc, also because of the potential playout. If I were to play G4 right now and he plays a move like potentially D1 or H5 in response, I want to make sure that the standard mid-game kind of treatment that I do to the edge in terms of, say, if G4, H5, and if I were to jump into H6 and he plays something like H3 in a response, I want to make sure that H4 is not poisoned in any way along the top right mini diagonal. So I would kind of say that after having checked that, he's controlling this mini diagonal, it's perfectly safe for me and it's not poison for me. So I think so far it does look safe for me to just jump immediately into G4.
まあ、当初の予定通り H のように打つつもりでいます。まあ、D の位置付けてもね、なくはないかなっていう気がしていますが、まあそんなに得でもないかな。D の位置、F の位置と打たれると、当てるではさすがに渋いんで、まあ上辺は残しつつ H の4でいいかなと思っています。サクッと打っちゃいます。
Okay, so white has chosen to play H4. Yeah, essentially earlier I mentioned both kind of coupling moves to the edge would be D8 and H4. H4 potentially is very strong in a sense that it keeps to the edge. At the same time, I'm pretty safe to the bottom edge given that H4 is being played. So what I would really like to think about right now is about the edges to the right and to the top. One of the threats that white has established is to re-establish the F4 disc that gives him that option again to that edge treatment that I mentioned earlier. So with F4, he can play C1 and anticipate a response, a standard response from me to D1 and followed by E1, and at the same time he retains that excess or a spare move to C2. So that's one of my concern right now. So if I were to play to H5 and he immediately does that sequence, not only does he have one extra move at the same time, I'm kind of forced to potentially remove that right disc at H4 that unpoisons his D8 move. So that's a bit concerning right now. So potentially if I were to play to H5 and he does that sequence to C1, I want to look at weaknesses potentially of him removing the E3 disc, which probably opens up an option for me to B6. So in some sense I can find comfort in that. If I were to play H5 and he plays H3, opens up this F5 disc that allows me to jump into G6. So that's almost like a comfort zone. At the same time, it's not a likely scenario to happen. On the flip side, if you were to respond to hit my H5 and just grab the edge to H6, I'll probably need to feed off the unbalanced edge to him, and then basically black, white, and if I were to play black here, he probably just forms an balance edge, and I don't have any excess over here, and I'll be forced to kind of jump out. Okay, so I think having that in mind, I'll just go with the safer approach, which is H5.
まあちょっと、この中盤のやり取りで、やや白が得してるんじゃないかなっていう気がしていて、形勢判断としてはプラ4から、プラ6ぐらいあるんじゃないかなって今思っています。右辺取り込んでいっていいかなっていう当初の読み通りのつもりでいます。そうですね。そのまま取っちゃいます。
Okay, so white has chosen to take the edge, so that kind of leaves me with very limited choices because white right now has the E6 disc that threatens to play into H3. I almost have to immediately respond to H3 to make him form that unbalanced edge first before thinking about anything else. So I'll just go ahead with that move.
一瞬ねG6もよりますが、そんなに得じゃないかな。むしろ右辺取られて微妙なので、右辺取ってって、H にですね取って、なんとか左側に黒を引っ張り出したいかなっていうところですかね。取っちゃいます。
Okay, so white has indeed selected H2, grab the unbalanced edge to the top, but that's balanceable because if I were to jump in right now to G6, it gives him an immediate response to H7, establishing the balance edge. At the same time, he still has that option to carve out the balance edge sequence to the top. That tempo sequence to the top, and at the same time, I don't have any excess over here. So this is kind of concerning. If I were to play a floating X square, he jumps in to G6. I basically still am forced to play out a move. So that is also a bit of a weakness on my end. One of the options I'm thinking right now is to play the G8 because G8 basically gives me an option if he were to play into g6. I can play g7 perhaps. So also because I'm short of time, 8.5 minutes to go. Let's see. If I were to play to the top edge, it unpoisons this c2 move almost too immediately. It's probably not what I want to look at the moment since he's chasing down this move. Yeah, I have to either take it, prevent it. I can't prevent it. Then I'll probably have to poison it potentially. So poisoning it means g8. Taking it means g6. So I think it's fairly safe to say that it's between these two moves right now. So one of the interesting things about Shaman and the H sequence is that G8 is always kind of like a runaway move, or a move that, you know, it's a spare tempo that is kind of like a last escape route for you. If I were to play G6 and he plays H7, and then I play G8, for example, I lose the potential surprise factor or the tempo in order to kind of feed off the unbalanced edge. But another concern I have is that if I were to play to G8 and he plays, it opens up this disc to be taken away by White's C8. So that's probably not what I want to do as well. So I think G6 is kind of like a safe sequence that kind of potentially leads me to potentially a straightforward loss. So I like to probably challenge the norm and go for G8.
まあ、ちょっとあるのかなって思いつつ、いやでもこれはさすがに優勢を意識してますって言っていいんじゃないかな。まあ16第一巻でまあすぐかとか G の7を狙ってるんだとは思いますが、まあその分ね、黒に制約ができるというか、7列7行か7行を7列か行だっけいや7の行が、黒は一色にできないので連打が発生するためなので、まあ打ち込んでいいんじゃないかな。そうします。
Okay, so White has strangely jumped into G6 almost immediately. Probably not something that I would expect in response, but if I were to jump into the X square right now, potentially the support or the poisoning disc is actually very thin in a sense that it's only C7, and right now I only have 6 minutes on the clock. A bit concerning, but I think I'll probably have to jump in right away, and potentially he might force me to kind of poison myself and force me to flip away this and giving him a quiet move to H7 followed by H8 corner. But in terms of tempo, I think that's pretty much my only option.
なるほど。まあでもこれはね、ありがたいような気がしています。まあ、上辺 C1 から打っていけば1点粘れそうだな、1点粘れるというか、相手に手を渡せそうだなと思っていて、でただ、今考えているのは、まあ、C1、2、1、E1、上辺乗り込んでいった後に、C9 が取ってしまうので、B の6っていう黒の手ができてしまうと考えていて、なので、1回 C の8を先に入れるかどうかっていうのを考えています。まあ、C8 入れれば、まあ、素直に来てくれればですけど、C8、D8、C1、D1、E1 に対して、さっきだったら B の6が、横方向しか返せなかったんですけど、そのタイミングで B の6を打つと、C の7の石も返ってしまうので、まあ、白にとって得なんじゃないかなっていう意図で C8 を入れるかどうかを考えています。 ただまあ、それはさすがにプロも承知なので、まあ、C8 に対しては素直に D の8には来ないんじゃないかなっていうところですかね。なのでまあね、C8 に対して、まあ、B の3とか打ってくるのかなとか考えつつ、それってどっちが優勢なんだっけっていうようなことを今考えてます。そうですね、なんかやっぱり B6 きれいに打たれるのが嫌なので C8 を先に入れようかなと思ってます。まあ C8 に対して F1 だったら C2、D8、C の1から D1、E1、D の1、右上の X1 っていうような形で優勢だろうなっていうところなので、まあ、C8 に対してはおそらく B の3かな。まあ、それに対しては一旦 B の4とお付き合いするか、もしくは E の1って打っていくか、まあ、1回お付き合いしてから上辺かな。それでも、まあ白が打ちやすいんじゃないかなって思ってます。というわけで C8 にします。
Okay, so white has played to c8, probably begging a response to d8 at this point in time. Establishing d8 almost immediately poisons my disc to the bottom left straight away, and of course the c7 disc still remains very vulnerable to attack because that's essentially the only disc post my d8 move that will protect myself or prevent from a h7 h8 combo. So right now I would kind of look at this bottom right and bottom two squares as more of like a 4 square region. If I were to play into d8 immediately, it kind of carves out like a parity zone for white that is very strong. Probably something I want to think about there. At the same time, my other alternate options would be to potentially just branch out. So probably B6 would be a direct branch out option. At the same time, B3, expecting a B4 and then followed by a A4 response, keeping to the edge and forcing white to the top edge could be a potential option as well. At the same time, interacting to the top probably wouldn't make sense if I were to play to F1. If I were to play to G1, it would probably make a bit more sense in terms of the shape and maintaining parity to the top right. So G1 potentially opens up a C1 D1 potential combo to F1 and E1, which forces the corner. So that's probably something I want to avoid in this game as well. Also considering that I'm short of time, only just 4 minutes left. I'm gonna go ahead with playing B3 just to maintain the tempo to the top.
まあそうですね。まあ1回 B の4が第1巻で、まあ、E の1もあるけど、ちょっと、まあ、さっきと同じような形で B6 がやっぱりちょっと懸念なので、まあ、B4、A4 入れてから E1 が第1巻でいます。まあ、下辺もね、白に主導権があると思っているので、まあね、これは見計らって D の8、白から打ち込んで、黒に当てさせる、D8、D8 の交換をね、いつ入れるのかっていうことも考えつつですが、まあ、右下に連打狙っていける形なのでね、まあ、一回右側にしますかね。
Okay, so white has indeed jumped into B4. So my anticipated move is to play A4, so that essentially the objective of this entire sequence is just to kind of shift the move back to white so that white can create more moves for myself.
これでね、D8 に対して E8 でラインが取ってくれればね、右下連打なんですけど、もう一個余分な石がありますねっていう形ですかね。まあ、 黒がね B5 に打ったタイミングで白が D8 なんか打つとね、斜めも返ってしまう、E の8が斜めも返ってしまうなんていうことも狙いつつ、まあここはいいのにして十分かなと思ってます。
Okay, so white has played to e1, which essentially gives him access right now to b5, which actually connects to the bottom region. One of the reasons why I feel safe at the moment is because these two regions are not connected at the same time, so the poisoning factor of removing all of these discs along the 7th row is just lesser at the moment. So I want to kind of prevent that from happening at the moment, so I'll probably react to play d1 with the sole purpose of just trying to maintain this diagonal. Of course, bearing in mind that white always has that option to a3 and just to cut into the center of a 3 disc and immediately establish access anytime he wants. So that's a bit concerning at the moment. Okay, I think I'll just go ahead with playing d1.
まあ上辺取ってって十分かなと思ってるんで取ります。まあ、一応まだ優勢を意識していて、まあ、どんぐらいかな、6から8ぐらいあるかなと思ってます。
Okay, so white is responding pretty quickly over here. If I were to jump into c2 right now, it gives him a direct access with b1 and cuts into the d3 disc. Probably not something I want at the moment. Another thing to think about is about feeding up the unbalanced edge, and it forms something that is not really attackable, so that severely limits my options. Probably b6 is something that I would eventually need to play too, potentially feeding off the balance edge and jumping into b6, but b6 clears out these two discs and gives a clean a3, so that's also something of concern at the moment. So I'll play along. If I were to play along b5 and anticipate b6 respawn, black, white, black. Potentially, I could still squeeze out one more move to d8, which is unpoisoned because I don't have this to a5. Okay, I'll go ahead with b5 then.
なるほど。これはまあ素直に B6 を押して、その後 C2 だったら、上辺がね結構確定で山の形になる気がするので、まあ素直に応じていいんじゃないかなって思っています。ちょっと他まあいい D8 どうかな。いや D8B6E8 はなんか黒の方が得している気がするんで、素直にお付き合いします。
Okay, so white has indeed played b6. I'm just leaving d8 as a spare move right now, just looking to the top edge how I must play. So I think the support is getting pretty thin. Pretty much don't have much of an option over here. Okay, I'll probably feed off the unbalanced edge right now. If I were to play any move to the bottom, that would immediately mean a loss in support and poison, potentially. Another potential move I could look at is e8. I'm running short of time right now. Okay, I'll play e8 as a defense maneuver just to thicken the border. Just trying to keep this poison as much as possible until he forces me.
まあ、C の2で上辺当てられてウイングの形になって、まあ、X 来てくれればなんか偶数理論に左下で7個使っていけそうなので、まあ、一番ありそうなのは C の 2F の 1G の1に対して、A の6か、そう来た時にどうするか、まあ、下辺当てて取らせて綺麗に偶数になるかなってことを考えてます。まあさすがに勝ってるだろうなっていう読みではいますが、 まあ、どれが一番紛れなく勝てるのかなっていうことを考えてます。そうですね。まあでも、シーミはそれ変わんないので、打っちゃいます。
Okay, white has jumped in, so I'll just feed off the unbalanced edge.
まあ、ここで A の6を先に入れるかどうか、さすがにないかな。まあ、取って、まあ十分ですね。十分。
Okay, so right now white has taken our balance edge. First instinct is to just jump right in, potentially just to grab it and feed off the unbalanced edge. Another option is to play the a6, keep that sequence there, but that doesn't really benefit me to the bottom right. So I guess I'll just have to go for x square.
これはかなり読みやすくなったかなと思っていて、例えば A6、A5 に対して下辺当てて、取らせて B7 なんかで、まあ、綺麗に偶数にはなるかなと思っています。まあ、先下辺当てた方が、あとかな、下辺先当てて A6 の方が紛れなさそうかな、どうかな。そうですね。かなりなんか対象できそうな気がしてきてます。下辺当てます。
Okay, running out of time here, so. Okay, so indeed, Takanashi has kind of forced me into that sequence over here to poison, so I'll just try to play out the moves as fast as possible, so that at least we can see the end result of the game.
連打でかなり4辺全部取れそうですね。
Ah, okay. Sorry. Okay, yeah, so good game, Takanashi.
Good game.
Thank you. So I will ask Keith-san to come back. Yeah, just give me a second. Yeah. Okay, so Keith-san has joined. Hello, Keith. Thanks for joining in. So the game has just ended, and yeah, basically the result is I lost quite badly. Yeah. Unfortunately, towards the mid game and the end game, I didn't have much time, and he played quite a few surprising moves, and I think he was quite sharp throughout the commentary towards the tail end, even when he was also short of time, and yeah. So I was probably quite taken off guard, given that potentially, I thought that I have more experience in terms of talking through games. But yeah, I would like to tell him, congratulations on a great game, and yeah, thanks for the commentary and your participation.
Okay. I was expecting you to have a chance because you won Nakajima-san and also Ben CD.
Yes.
So, yeah, okay, I'll let him know. 高橋さん、
はい、
今回の参加で本当にありがとうございます。で、まあその最後でちょっとアレックさんはもう時間がなくて苦労していましたって言っていました。でも本当にすごく勉強になっていい試合でした。
本当にこちらこそ、そうですね。なんかあんまり最近僕が、オセロに対して、時間を取っていないというか、あまり、このコロナ禍で、大会とかもなかったので、すごく久しぶりのこの試合だったというんですけど、本当にこうアレックスっていう、強豪プレイヤーと戦えて、僕もなんかこう久しぶりに楽しかったですし、すごくこう世界大会を思い出すような熱戦だったと思います。
Yeah, so Alex, Takanashi-san hasn't really been playing for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So having the chance to play with you, he really felt reminded of his championship days,
Mm-hmm.
and he had a lot of fun.
Okay.
It was a very good experience for him.
Okay. So about this game, I just wanted to ask him, does he know about the Shaman opening? Because the Shaman opening was a opening that I actually picked up from one of the top online players, Ruru.
うん、
Yeah.
そう今回彼は序盤でシャーマンオープニングという、技を使いました。で、ここでなんか感想が何かありますか？
そうですね、あまりこう経験が多い展開ではなかったんですけど、過去に、何回かは経験していて、それを思い出しながら打っていて、そうですね、なんだろう、すごく嫌な手を打たれたなって、ちょっとね最初苦戦したんですけども、その後は、うまくまとめられたかなというような印象ですかね。
Yeah, this isn't a play that Takanishi-san is quite familiar with. So at the beginning, he was still trying to get a sense, but later in the later part of the game, he managed to take control.
Yep.
Of the move.
Yeah, definitely agree.
Mm.
Yeah. So thank you, Takanashi-san, for joining the exhibition game, and yeah, thank you very much for joining this. And yeah, I hope to meet you at the next World Othello Championship if there's the opportunity.